Let's see. Hello, everybody. We'll start in a few minutes.
I'm gonna go to bathroom first.
Oh, okay.
That means we're muted, right? Because if you hit it, it's unmuted. So I think this is muted. I couldn't say.
Yeah.
Hey, Randy, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can.
Oh, okay. Because I'm trying to mute. Okay.
Yeah, I actually have to turn up the volume a little bit. It's been a while since I've done one of these things from home. I've been using the Zoom rooms at the library. I have to get used to the way we used to do it, like this. So you can hear me then.
Okay. I guess I just asked you if you could hear me now, but you couldn't. So I guess I just wanted to make sure I knew how to mute.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. Okay. We'll just wait patiently.
Okay. Yeah, we'll be starting in a few.
Okay.
If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer them while we wait. Yeah, the picture you see up there actually, it's a house that was there at the time when Washington came through at Longbridge Farm, and it was around in the 1700s, but not in that form. That house has been heavily altered, but it's the only thing we have as far as a photograph of anything that was around from a long time ago. It's probably from the 1800s, but I think parts of the foundation go back to the 1700s. But it's kind of a nice picture.
Absolutely.
There used to be the original picture I have. There was a Pinto. It was taken in the 70s. There was a Ford Pinto and another car there, a 70s car. They're right in front. And I thought, well, it's a good picture, but let's see. I photoshopped them out, so now we don't have to see the 70s car there. Well, that's kind of interesting in its own right, but I didn't want it. I wanted a picture that had without the cars. So I think Ed is here. I think I see his phone there. Is Ed Belding, are you in attendance out there?
Yes, I am, Randy. I am here and ready to go.
Funding for the Space Kitchen, Leah's Legacy, was provided by the Melvin S. Cohen Foundation, Incorporated.
I don't know what that is, but
Mrs. Restaurant served as a test kitchen for Chef Leah Case. where
Huh.
throughout her lifetime she explored the culinary
You
traditions
know
of
what?
other
If
cultures.
everybody could see if I can
Insisting
figure out
that
how
the
to mute
Lord
everybody here.
disconnected.
Those are our
Friends there.
advertisers, I think.
I'm gonna. See, I can't mute all though because then I'll mute Ed, and that'll put a crimp in our operation here. But okay, it seemed to have stopped. So Ed, take it away. And like I have the picture up of the farmhouse at Longbridge Farm, the one that may have been there, the foundation at least during the time of the when Washington came through and all that. You know the picture.
Oh, okay, Randy, I'm ready to go.
Okay.
I'm going to start with going back to Thomas Lawrence,
Okay.
the person who got this all started with Longbridge Farm.
Okay, I have the slide up about Longbridge Farm and about how Lawrence ran the farm, and it was established in the 1730s. So go ahead and take it away.
Okay. The colonial plantation of Longbridge Farm was originally contained within 15,600 acre tract purchased by Peter Sonmans from the East Jersey proprietors in 1693 in what was then the recently formed Middlesex County. Sonmans' vast parcel of undeveloped land extended upstream from the Raritan River along both sides of what is today known as Lawrence Brook, almost as far south as Kingston. So therefore, this parcel, this Sonmans' land, included most of what we know of as South Brunswick Township today. It also included adjoining municipalities, so this was a very large area of land. It was from the upper end of Sonmans' Tract that in 1733, 800 acres were carved out and sold to Thomas Lawrence, forming the basis for what shortly became known as Longbridge Farm. Lawrence also owned other blocks of land downstream along the brook that has historically been identified by his family's name, including a tract at its mouth that was apparently acquired in 1689 by an older Thomas Lawrence, who was a baker in New York City. He was possibly the father of the Thomas Lawrence who is identified with Longbridge Farms. So there is some debate as to which Lawrence the Lawrence Brook is named after. However, we know that the Thomas Lawrence that we're zeroing in on was the one who started Longbridge Farm. Thomas Lawrence was born in 1689 in New York. In 1719, he married Rachel Longfield of Raritan, New Jersey. But by the early 1720s, he had relocated to Philadelphia and begun a successful career as a merchant. Lawrence quickly rose to take his place among the Quaker City's cultural and mercantile elite. He was a subscriber to the Dancing Assembly, an exclusive aristocratic group formed by Philadelphia's most prominent families. A member of the Schuylkill Fishing Company, the first sporting fishing club in the colonies. And he was junior warden of Christ Church for a time. Lawrence's financial interests were diverse and reached as far as Barbados in the West Indies and Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. One of his letter books from 1725 states that he had a fine new ship called the Sarah L. Lawrence, which was plying between places as far afield as Jamaica, South Carolina, and Holland. He traded in a diverse stock of commodities and sundries, including tobacco, molasses, flour, and Indian corn. By 1730, a partnership had been formed between Lawrence and Edward Shippen, another wealthy and influential Philadelphia merchant, to take part in the lucrative fur trade. Thomas Lawrence was perhaps best known for his civic and political activities. In 1722, he was elected a common councilman of the city of Philadelphia, and 2 years later was chosen an alderman. 1728, he qualified for a seat in the provincial council. He also presided as judge of the county court and served on the State House Committee. In other words, this was a very important individual. Most of his time was, of course, in Philadelphia. His summers he liked to spend at Longbridge Farm. 1736 and 37, Lawrence was sent by the provincial council to Lancaster County in order to address the eviction of settlers in the Susquehanna Valley. And in 1745, he was delegated as one of the commissioners from Pennsylvania charged with deliberating on land and trade issues with the Six Nation Indian tribes of the Iroquois League of Albany. In 1747, he was appointed lieutenant colonel of the Associated Regiment of Foot for Philadelphia. This position had been offered to Benjamin Franklin, who declined to accept it, suggesting Lawrence in his place because of his more extensive military experience. Lawrence served terms as mayor of Philadelphia in 1727, 28, 34, 49, and 53. He was serving his final term in 1754 when he passed away from a fit of sickness, so we don't know exactly what he died from. Thomas Lawrence's obituary notice recorded the death of so able and diligent a magistrate as a public loss. Okay, that ends my bio on Lawrence, Thomas Lawrence, and if anybody has any questions at this point, Randy and I will be able to handle them, right, Randy?
Yeah. I just wanted to point out that I thought it was interesting that one of the positions was offered to Benjamin Franklin, but he declined because he thought that that Lawrence would be better served in that position. I thought that was interesting. And the other thing is
this also indicates what a high flyer Thomas Lawrence was. I mean, this was a big figure back at the time. And we're talking about, leading up to the French and Indian War. And I don't know, it doesn't indicate what Lawrence's military background was, but if Ben Franklin said that he had some military experience, well, you got to believe it. I just don't have any details on that military experience.
I was just surprised at how he seemed like so well-to-do. He was a member of the dancing assembly, and I have a picture here of when the dancing assembly was in the Academy of Music in Philadelphia. It was for elite women and men to dance together, and they carefully matched pairs. So only certain people got to get in there and mix in, and he was one of those people. And the other thing about the Schuylkill Fishing Company that I found interesting, it's the oldest continuously active social club in the English-speaking world. So that means everywhere, even England. They contest it. They said the Beefeaters Club might be older, but still, it's hard to tell. There's a dispute over that, but still, it's one of the oldest social clubs in the English-speaking world. So I thought that was an interesting little tidbit that I found out when I was looking through Lawrence's history.
Right, and what you're indicating is this is the development of the American upper class, and Thomas Lawrence is a contributor and involved in that construction of the upper class, the elite, so to speak. And you notice they had these exclusive organizations to express their wealth and their elitism. And this is important because a lot of our leaders are going to come out of this type of thing for the American Revolution. And you combine that with the Freemasons. So these organizations for the elite are very important for the making of our social structure as we head towards becoming an independent nation.
And I thought there was a question. I heard sounded like someone had a question out there.
Okay, fire away.
This is Dave. I have, I guess, two questions or comments. Sarah Lawrence, is that, that was the name of his boat. That's like the name of a college now, too. And any correlation? And also, is this the same Lawrence that named Lawrence Township in Lawrenceville after in here in New Jersey?
I believe so.
On both counts, I would say no. Lawrence is not that uncommon an Anglo name, and I'm sure that in both cases, again, you're talking about people that were probably in the elite category as far as our class structure is
Want to go
concerned.
pee? Want to go pee?
But I don't have any connection between Sarah Lawrence. I guess it's a college or a university, and Lawrenceville. It's a possibility, but I doubt it. As I say, this Lawrence was basically set in Philadelphia, and he's more well known in Philadelphia than he is in South Brunswick. All he created here for his family was a summer place, a place to get away from it all, the city of Philadelphia. So I don't know the connection with those two.
Let's I had another question too about Lawrence Brook. I have a picture of Lawrence Brook here that I taken last year. It's a really nice picture, but there was some sort of Lawrence Brook wasn't named after him, from what I remember you saying. Is that right, Ed?
Well, it's up in the air.
It's up in the air. Okay.
But I would say this: the Lawrence, who was the baker from New York City, preceded the Thomas Lawrence who set up Longbridge Farm, and Lawrence Brook probably got its name before Thomas Lawrence built Longbridge Farm. There is a problem with Lawrence Brook in that, and I'll mention it in the second part. But on one of the maps, the Daily map, which is a colonial map that was done in the early 1700s, it has Lawrence Brook running into Heathcote Brook. Now, we know that Lawrence Brook ran north and east, and Heathcote Brook ran south and west. And Longbridge Farm is in between the headwaters of those two brooks, and they don't run together. That would be an impossibility. So I'm leaning to the thing that the Baker Lawrence from New York City, who owned land along Lawrence Brook, it was named after him and not Thomas Lawrence of Longbridge Farm.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, we all set?
Yeah, we're set. I was wondering which slide we have it. I remember I had a picture of an undeveloped land. It's just basically a field. I don't know if you wanted to have that
Right.
running.
I'm up to number 7 on the list. So if you
Number
have
7, bridge.
yeah, if you have
Okay.
some pictures, bridge over a brook. If you have something before that, just show that, and then start with number 7 when I start talking again.
Okay, yeah. What I have the picture of, it's called the West Indian Man. It was one of the ships that was commonly used for moving things between the Indies and England, because that was one of the ships that he might have had. We don't know what his ship looked like, but I have something here that might have looked like one of the ships that he owned. And the other thing is I have just tobacco, molasses, corn, and flour, some of the things that they would be moving on those ships. And now I'm over at I just have a generic picture. It's a beautiful picture, but it has nothing to do with South Brunswick. It's a beautiful stone arch bridge that goes over a brook. But I couldn't find anything to quite match that description. So now we're on the slide of a beautiful stone arch bridge over a pretty brook.
Okay, and I'll continue. I'm sure Thomas Lawrence would be proud of the bridge that you're showing there. So
Yeah, I
that
think
we're all set.
Yeah, he'd
Okay.
like.
The plantation derived its name from the bridge that carried the forerunner of present-day Ridge Road over Lawrence Brook. Okay? And although Longbridge Farm property did straddle the headwaters of both drainages, which rise in an area of ill-defined wetland that wraps around to the north, east, and south of the settlement that we now call Monmouth Junction, then as now Lawrence Brook flowed northeast to the Raritan River, while Heathcote Brook, although known historically as opposite Brook, meaning it went the other way, because of its unusual direction of flow, contrary to most of the nearby creeks, drained west into the Millstone River. And it's interesting, the Millstone River flows north. The Raritan River flows east and south. And that is so, in other words, Longbridge Farm is in a very interesting area.
So Lawrence Brook flows north.
More on the farm. So
Okay.
now, Randy, you can start showing some of the I don't know if you have number 8 there, large farm field.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, here we go. Longbridge Farm was no ordinary real estate investment for Thomas Lawrence. This was one of his principal properties and served as his summer residence. Even at its smallest extent in the pre-revolutionary period, Longbridge Farm always amounted to at least 800 acres and was worked by what was apparently a substantial labor force, including slaves and an overseer. However, the extent to which this vast colonial property was profitable from an agricultural standpoint remains largely unknown. Plantations of this size and scope, such as Longbridge Farm, were actually quite rare in the colonial agrarian landscape of New Jersey. In other words, this was an unusual farm. The norm being the family farm in between 100 and 200 acres worked by an extended family with the help of a small number of hired hands, indentured servants, or slaves. Rarely could any of these more typical smaller farms afford to supplement their family workforce with more than 3 or 4 laborers at any one time. It turns out that Longbridge Farm had the largest number of slaves of any farm in the South Brunswick area. Plantations utilizing vast labor forces dominated by slaves, like those so characteristic of the southern colonies and the Caribbean islands, were few and far between.
You put a little bit more salt, but not too much. Just the cat.
This was largely because the colony lacked a profitable cash crop. A tradable, saleable commodity like indigo, tobacco. There was also an aversion to the practice of slavery among many of the colony's residents, especially among Quakers. You might know that the nearest Quakers were in the Princeton area. And so that was not far from the Longbridge Farm.
Okay, Ed, I'm going to do something here. I'm going to mute all, and then I'm going to unmute you because we're getting a lot of background sound. So just we'll pause for like 10 seconds. Hold on a second.
Oh, I thought they were cheering.
All right, hold on.
Okay, Randy, I'm unmuted.
Okay, so you're good now. We should be good to go. And we're up to the next slide now.
Okay, I'm missing all my fans already. Okay, here we go.
Okay.
That is not to say that slaves were rare in colonial New Jersey. Even in areas with sizable Quaker populations, both Dutch American and non-Quaker Anglo-American settlers commonly held slaves.
Oh, shit.
A census taken in 1726 found that approximately 8% of the total population of New Jersey was non-white. More than 2,581 African Americans were recorded in this census, and most of these individuals were enslaved persons. 1745, another census reported 4,606 slaves in the colony, once again constituting about 8% of the total population. My calculations indicate that South Brunswick at this time probably had a slave population closer to 10% than 8%. In other words, a little higher. Okay, Randy, I'm finished with that part.
Okay.
So if there are any questions, I don't know, you have people muted, right?
Yeah, but anybody who has a question could unmute and feel free to ask your question.
Okay.
And they can put it into the chat too if they want. I can read it off there.
Okay, and by the way, Randy, we're down to number 11.
Okay, so we went past horses and we're now on to John Lawrence.
Right.
Now this picture may or may not be John Lawrence. He also was a mayor of Philadelphia, but it was a little unclear whether this is an actual likeness of him or not. But we're going to go with it because we're not sure. So I'm
Okay.
claiming that it may not be him.
Okay, that's okay. I'm sure he would be proud of the picture. Probably looks better than he actually looked anyway. Okay, here we go. Prior to the death of Thomas Lawrence, ownership of Longbridge Farm passed to his son, John. At the time of his father's demise, John Lawrence was in possession of the core 800 acres of Longbridge Farm, and according to the provisions of Thomas's will, was to receive an additional 1,054 adjacent acres. Now, what that does is put him in competition with John Wetherell's plantation, because the Dutch were in favor of calling the large farms plantations rather than farms. So all total, John Lawrence was owning a farm that was close to 1,900 acres, which was very large for those days. John Lawrence was almost as prominent in Philadelphia social and political circles as his illustrious father. In the pre-Revolutionary War period, he likewise served as a common councilman, alderman, and then mayor of Philadelphia from 1765 to 1767. And he was also an attorney for the Supreme Court of Pennsylvania, a clerk of the Quarter Sessions, and a judge of the Supreme Court. Although John Lawrence was educated in England and traveled overseas after the Revolutionary War, for most of his life he resided in Philadelphia and spent his summers, like his father, at Longbridge Farm. He died at Longbridge in 1799, as did his wife Elizabeth in the following year.
I have a question.
Okay.
I have a question.
Now we're gonna start on the Revolutionary War stuff, but somebody may have a question on John Lawrence.
Well, I have a
And
question. I have a
yeah,
question.
go ahead.
Not only about not so much about John, but they always make the distinction that this is a plantation and rather than a farm. And you were saying the Dutch use the term plantation. Is it just the terminology that's different, or is it a different idea behind a farm versus a plantation?
Well, the Dutch had a status thing. In other words, when you throw these terms around, whether they're Anglo terms or Dutch terms, a yeoman farmer is a farmer who has a small farm and no slaves. Okay? Then you have a farmer. A farmer is the one that has the 100 to 200 acre type of farm, which was the most common. Then you have a gentleman farmer. A gentleman farmer is of the upper class. He doesn't actually do the farming. He gets other people to do the farming.
Hmm.
And when you get into the gentleman farmer category, the term that was preferred by the elite would be the plantation. And my understanding is that the Dutch were using that type of term first, and then the English picked up on it.
Okay.
So that sort of gives you an idea of what you're talking about.
So it's a rich man's farm.
Yeah, yeah. And a plantation indicates that you have a number of slaves. And if you see, a southern plantation always has a large number of slaves. A northern plantation would not necessarily have a large number of slaves.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
And that's because you didn't have a big giant cash crop like cotton or tobacco, something
right.
like that, or sugar cane. Okay?
And what was the crop? You mentioned flax, right?
Yeah, flax, and of course the grains, the wheat, and basically to feed the horses, because Longbridge Farm for many, many years was known as a stud farm. And people from actually other colonies, as well as New Jersey, wealthy farmers would bring their mares to Longbridge Farm for stud service. And I'll get into it a little bit later, but there's a famous horse that was at Longbridge Farm. And a lot of the wealthy farmers wanted thoroughbred horses, because horse racing was very big in colonial times. And a lot of money was gambled on horse races. And the elite farmers also had elite horses. And this was a big status symbol.
So these weren't workhorses. These weren't workhorses.
No, not in the long run. There were some horses that were dray horses and so forth. But Longbridge Farm was mainly known for stud service for thoroughbred horses. And some of those horses were racing horses.
Okay, thank you.
All right, now we're down to the Revolutionary War time, so then you can start with number 12.
12? Okay.
All
Hold on a
right?
second. I'm getting there, yeah.
Okay, and there'll be some information on John Lawrence in here too, what happened to him during the Revolution. Okay, the status of Longbridge Farm during the early years of the Revolutionary War is of some interest, presumably because of his Republican leanings, meaning he was leaning towards the Patriot side, not the Tory side. When the British approached and then occupied Philadelphia in the fall of 1777, John Lawrence was put under arrest and placed on parole. Remember, he was at Longbridge Farm in the summer. So when the fall rolls around, he's back in Philadelphia. Big mistake, because then he's put under parole, and that's basically like house arrest. He was subsequently confined in Pennsylvania, his parole obligation finally being discharged on June 30th, 1778, a few days after the British removal from Philadelphia for New York and the somewhat inconclusive Battle of Monmouth. So he was confined in Philadelphia for almost a year. The fact that George Washington and the main body of the Continental Army camped at Longbridge, we've covered this before, prior to the Battle of Monmouth on the night of June 25th, 26, raises several questions, none of which can satisfactorily be answered. They're talking about his stay at Longbridge Farm. Was John Lawrence privy to the Continental Army's use of his property? See, here's the deal with that. Thomas Wetherell, a nephew of John Wetherell, was in charge of Longbridge Farm when John Lawrence wasn't there. So a Wetherell was running Longbridge Farm when George Washington encamped his soldiers there. Now, it may be that George Washington got permission from the Wetherells there because John Lawrence was not in communication. He was confined in Philadelphia. But that's questionable. He might have given permission. I don't know. Did he, in fact, make the plantation available to Washington? That's still a question mark. What was the condition of the plantation during the period of Lawrence's confinement in Philadelphia? It was probably in pretty good shape, and this would be, if you're talking about June, then the planting season already took place, and I would say that the plantation, since it wasn't on the major path, I'm talking about Route 27 now, the King's Highway, for the British to come storming down and so forth, it probably was in pretty good shape because it's a long Ridge Road, and the British weren't using Ridge Road as they were using Route 27. So as far as pillaging and taking animals and that sort of thing, I doubt if the British were doing too much to Longbridge Farm. Was the property farmed, or did it lie virtually abandoned and open to the ravages of competing British and armed American forces? No, I think things went on as per usual with certain precautions taken. But with their large workforce there and so forth, I think they were able to just carry on. Then there's background information about the American forces that came through. On Thursday, June 25th, the Army marched from Rocky Hill through Kingston and encamped for the night at Longbridge. This is about 6,000 soldiers who were left because Washington had sent about 3,000 men ahead to harass the British as they were marching through Monmouth County, headed towards the site of the Battle of Monmouth, just above Freehold. The following morning, the American troops continued on to Crossroads and then turned south along George's Road. Now, Randy, you have some pictures of some of the famous officers who stayed at Longbridge Farm?
I do, starting with Nathaniel Greene. So let me go ahead. So we have, I found all of them that were on the list. So I had Nathaniel Greene, Sterling. So I can just, you can't see the slides, but I'm showing Nathaniel Greene now. And
right.
Now I have Lord Sterling.
Okay.
I got von Steuben, General von Steuben, Henry Knox,
Okay.
Joseph Reed, and I have a picture of Cadwalader, but it's a picture of John and Elizabeth and their daughter, and it's just a great picture. But he's there with his wife and his child. It's a very nice picture.
Okay.
And then
Okay.
That's it for the officers. And then we go. The next is to the next picture is Weatherall Tavern. So
okay, good. I just wanted to mention, of those officers, the only one who was a New Jerseyan was Joseph Reed. All the other ones were from other colonies.
Okay.
Now we call them states. But it's interesting that these famous people that were in many major battles during the American Revolution, they all passed along Ridge Road through South Brunswick in order to get to the Battle of Monmouth. And I find it quite interesting that, we know of South Brunswick as a community where lots of people pass through it and never acknowledge it or stay for very long. They're basically commuting. And here is one of the first lists of famous people to pass through South Brunswick. And I think it's quite interesting as to who they are.
It is interesting.
Now, I'll pause here if anybody has a question before we get to the Weatherall Tavern and how that played into the thing.
Yeah, Dave, here, up and down the east or whatever, I heard growing up that George Washington slept here or there or anywhere. other than out in the encampment at Longbridge, did he actually sleep in a house that's still standing in South Brunswick?
As far as I can tell in the research I've done, there were a couple of possibilities for Washington. He did stay overnight in Kingston, which of course is part of South Brunswick. Half of Kingston is in South Brunswick. Exactly where he stayed that night has not been pinpointed, but it probably was a structure that's still standing on along Route 27. Okay, so he stayed a night there. As far as the next night, he could have stayed in the Longbridge mansion, in those days called a manse, or he could have stayed at the Wetherill Tavern, because many times the high officers did not stay with the men. The men were in the fields, they were in the barns, they were under trees, they were wherever they could have shelter. Washington gave orders to his men who stayed at Longbridge Farm to get rid of their tents in Kingston, leave them behind, because he wanted them traveling light so that they could move quickly in order to get to the site where they were planning to do the Battle of Monmouth. So I have my doubts that Washington stayed with his men. I have a feeling that he stayed at the Wetherill Tavern. But that's just conjecture on my part.
Okay, thank you. Interesting.
I thought it was
Okay,
interesting.
Randy.
Yeah, next we'll go to the Wetherall Tavern, but I just thought it was interesting how you pointed out that each one of those men that you just mentioned, we had lucky enough to have pictures of them, paintings of them, actually passed through town. And I think it's really significant, because if you put a picture to it, and then like maybe some background information, it really makes it a lot more interesting. But yeah, it was a good thing to point out. And then next we'll just go over to the Wetherall Tavern.
Okay. Now, I have some accounts, and if anybody's interested in those, I'll go back and read those. But there is actual documentation from some soldiers' diaries from Washington himself about the stay at Longbridge Farm. Of course, the spelling back in those days was horrendous, but you can still make out, such as there's one example where they call it Lorenz instead of Longbridge Farm. So I can get to those, but I want to get to the payment at the Wetherill Tavern and so forth. So here we go. An expense account of Robert Hanson Harrison contained within George Washington's papers lists the following. This is a quote. On the General's march through Jersey, June 25th, to John Hunt at Hopewell, 10-2-6, June 26th, to Thomas Wetherill, the morning after we left Kingston, $14. So George Washington paid Thomas Wetherill $14. It doesn't exactly say, the account doesn't say what the money was for. It could have been for the stay of his officers at the Wetherill Tavern. That was pretty high, $14 for that. And I'm sure Washington paid in continental script, which wasn't worth too much back in those days. But he probably paid for some supplies and so forth, and for the stay at Longbridge Farm. So that would entail the expense, but that's actually documented. So that means that George Washington not only passed through what you know as Dayton, back in those days called Crossroads, but he also stopped and at least had a light conversation with Thomas Wetherill. Now, I have some information on Thomas and some notes here, so I'll continue with that. And this is where we get into the stud horse, Randy, so you could show that for 17.
Okay.
In
It's a-
addition to owning a farm near to Longbridge, Thomas Wetherill was also the proprietor of the closest tavern to the Continental Army's encampment. It is likely that the $14 bill expense paid to Wetherill related to food, lodging, or provisions supplied to the Army, probably to Washington and his staff, at the tavern. But it is also possible that this expenditure may have been occurred more directly through the Army's occupation of Longbridge Farm. Now remember, you have a large farm, over 1,000 acres, but you have an army of 6,000 men. That takes up a lot of territory. While speculation, Thomas Wetherill may have served as John Lawrence's representative at the farm during the period of Lawrence's parole in Pennsylvania, and for some time thereafter. Well, that's a definite. We know that it was definite. Some support for Wetherill's involvement with Longbridge Farm is contained in 3 newspaper advertisements from 1778 to 1779, which refer to the finding of a stray horse and to the marketing of stud services of Bay Richmond. This was the prize horse that I was talking about, a thoroughbred horse owned by Lewis Morris. He imported the horse, probably had some Arabian stallion blood in that horse, and was stabled at Longbridge Farm. Mr. Thomas Wetherill at Longbridge Farm was given as the point of contact for each of these notices. So that puts Thomas Wetherill right there running Longbridge Farm when John Lawrence is not there. Now that Bay Richmond was such a prized horse that during the Revolutionary War, when the British were snooping about and they were foraging and all that, there were various farmers in the area that would hide Bay Richmond. So it wasn't at Longbridge Farm all the time. It was hidden away. And then when the coast was clear, they'd bring Bay Richmond back to Longbridge Farm. Interesting story. Now I finish up with John Lawrence, and then I'll open it up to questions for that. Despite the record of John and Elizabeth Lawrence's deaths at Longbridge in 1799 and 1800, respectively, it is difficult to trace their presence on the property after the Revolution. Judging from the tax-rateable assessments for what was then South Ward of New Brunswick, we were called the South Ward before we took the name South Brunswick Township. The plantation was much reduced in size and scope of operation. So after the Revolution, the farm was shrinking. That means that they were selling off parts of it to other people. John Lawrence was not listed in the tax ratables for June 1778, when he was still on parole in Philadelphia, or September 1779. His presence is documented between May 1780 and July 1782. But the property acreage during this period was recorded as falling from 295 acres to 240 acres. Now imagine, a farm that got as big as over 1,800 acres was now only 240 acres. He apparently held at the time of his father's death in the mid-1750s. The ratables also show him as holding only a single slave and never more than 2 horses, 6 cattle, and 2 hogs. So right after the American Revolution, or towards the end of it and so forth, this Longbridge Farm was shrinking down to almost nothing. From 1784 onward, John Lawrence disappears entirely from the tax-rateable records. He was perhaps abroad part of this time and primarily a resident in Philadelphia when in the United States. But it does seem that the plantation was in decline in the years following the Revolution. After John Lawrence's death in 1799, ownership of Longbridge Farm property transferred to his widow, Elizabeth Lawrence. Elizabeth later deeded Longbridge Farm to her daughter, also named Elizabeth. After the daughter's death, around 1800, the homestead parcel of approximately 268 acres now passed to Emily Ann, Elizabeth's sister. Okay, so that gets us up to the next century. Any questions? Hello?
So what was the smallest, the last, before, what was the size of it when it was last sold? I mean, it was still called Longbridge. I mean, it got sold down into smaller and smaller parcels. But what was the date? What's one of the last dates you had in there that you had read off?
Yes, around the year 1800, which is convenient to remember, the farm was less than 300 acres.
Okay.
So what happens, in other words, I would say this, Longbridge Farm was making money during the Revolution. For one reason or another, they had to downsize after the Revolution. There probably, the family was losing interest in it as a summer place. You remember their main area of location was Philadelphia. And it's quite a hike back in those days to go from Philadelphia to South Brunswick. So they were probably losing interest in maintaining a summer place. And it was logical. If you have a very large farm like that and you're losing interest in it, to sell off parcels of it. And so it wasn't anything that was a crisis for them. They probably just said, it's time, let's move on, and let's get rid of most of the property. And that's what they did.
You think it would be 2 days to get from Philadelphia to Longbridge back then? Or
back in that time, when you get up to after the American Revolution, you could get up to Princeton and Kingston by stagecoach in a day.
Oh, wow. Oh,
Okay.
I thought it was longer than that. That's pretty fast.
Yeah, and the common thing was, because Kingston was a big stopover back in those days, and what they would do is they'd get off the stage that came up from Philadelphia to Kingston, and they get on a stage that had come down from New York. For that stage's return trip, they would take the people from Philadelphia on theirs, and the ones who came down to Kingston from New York, they'd get on the one that came up from Philadelphia to go there. So it was an exchange place. And they were advertising that you could make it from Philadelphia to New York in a day and a half. But you're right, Randy. For a trip from Philadelphia to New York, realistically, you're talking 2 to 3 days.
I think they used to advertise them as flying machines or something like that. The new stage, the stagecoaches, because they were so fast, and it was something like that. I can't remember this. If that's not the
flying
exact term.
machine. Flying machine.
What? Yeah, flying machines. Right.
The advertisements, like the advertisements today, don't believe everything you see advertised.
It's like Flying United, right?
Yeah, take it with a grain of salt. Because, the roads were horrible, the weather was unpredictable, and the stay over or the places to rest and that sort of thing, there were always delays. Always delays. So, and then you had rivers to cross. You can imagine how slow it was to cross the Delaware River. Imagine how slow it was to cross the Raritan River. When you think about commuting today, it was a lot different back in those days.
Speaking
if they say you could take a stage in 1 day from Philadelphia to Kingston, that's a rare treat. That's a rare treat.
But speaking of bad roads, I just happen to have this picture here of the Griggs house, and this picture is it's from the early 20s. but it shows Ridge Road, and it's just a giant puddle of mud, and there's just mud and tracks everywhere. And it's an interesting picture, but this is already in the 20s, so it couldn't have been better back in the 1800s. So that's for sure.
Yeah, and it's interesting you brought that up. The reason why George Washington in Kingston picked Ridge Road to get to Cranberry. Now, you know how long around it is to go on Ridge Road, George's Road, 130 down to Cranberry, rather than take the Mapleton Plainsboro Road to Cranberry. The reason was the Mapleton Cranberry Road was swampy and low ground. And so Washington literally took the high road because the guides told him that was the best way to go. And at that time, he was really not in that much of a hurry to confront the British. At that time, they were just harassing the British. And then he finalized his plan for the Battle of Monmouth when he got to Cranberry. So Ridge Road was the road to take. Now, you're showing it as muddy and all that. Well, you can imagine it. And there was rain at that time that they were marching along. You can imagine the artillery and getting stuck in the mud with the cannon and all that. It was brutal. Well, it's the best word I can say. It was brutal.
And the other pictures I have, you have from the 1800s. So I had the Mershon house, the Roland Mershon house. I don't know if you wanted to talk about that, but I have the slide up here.
Yeah, that's okay. And you showed Ridge Road, right?
Yeah, I just showed Ridge when, it's like a giant muddy.
Okay, hold off. We'll stop at the Roland Mershon house.
Okay.
Okay, and I'll finish up on that because these are the later owners.
Right,
Emily Lawrence married Joseph Fowler, apparently relocated out of the area, so that ends it with the Lawrences in our area. And in 1834, sold the Longbridge property to Cornelius Cruiser and Frederick Farr. Later that same year, William Rowland purchased the 268-acre property for $5,500. William Rowland began amassing parcels of adjacent land, several of which had previously been part of the original Lawrence family holdings. So here is a sign that Longbridge Farm is coming back, reincarnated under William Rowland. In 1852, William Rowland sold 88 acres of the farm property to his son Stryker Rowland, who made his living locally as a storekeeper. Stryker Rowland retained ownership of much of the 88-acre farm property until 1895, when he transferred ownership to Isaac Rowland, Ann Groves, and James Rowland. A year later, these three individuals sold off a 2-acre parcel, including the dwelling that is believed to have been the principal Rowland residence, to Harvey Mershon. This property changed hands several times within the Mershon family during the first half of the 20th century, until it was eventually purchased by William and Dolores Zimmerman in 1951. In 1983, their daughter Janet Zimmerman purchased the historic homestead. Okay, and that's where my notes end with Longbridge Farm. The next thing is to talk about the site of the house and so forth.
Which house are you referring to?
Well, you know that the consensus in South Brunswick is that the Roland Mershon house was the manse for the Lawrence family. That's the one that's being worked on now. I think you're showing a picture of it, right?
No, I'm showing the one. It's the Pearson house. There's Pearson, Roland, Mershon, but the one you're talking about is the one that was being reconstructed. The one that's the original slide I had in the beginning.
Okay.
The one that's
Right.
the heavily altered one, right? Yeah, I don't have that one up right now. That's how I started off the slides with in the very beginning.
Yeah, it's okay. it's been slow going with that house. I drove by it today. It's it's wide open there for bad weather to rain on it. The thing is, that house is probably one of the houses, and of course it was added on to, that was part of Longbridge Farm.
Right.
Most of the maps show that the Longbridge Farm was located on the west or north side of Ridge Road. But we know that the Longbridge Farm was on both sides of Ridge Road. And the barn that burned down there on the east side of Ridge Road, I have a feeling that the manse was on the east side of that road, and probably not too far from the road, because back in those days, you notice a lot of colonial houses are not set way back from the road. They're pretty close to the road. That's for easy access with transportation the way it was. However, that's just a thought. Most people, most researchers, archaeologists, and so forth, say that the manse was on the west or north side of Ridge Road. Okay? Somewhere behind the, what do they have, an ambulance thing over there or a fire thing off a New Road? And somewhere in there is probably where it is. But really, it's anybody's guess. Anyway, I have information to share with you on that. Okay?
Okay.
And then after I do that, then the one you'll show will be the apple tree, 21.
Yeah. You want to show that now?
No, hold on. Just hold on. Let me just get through this. The precise location of the core of the Longbridge Farm plantation, the spot where the principal farmhouse occupied by the Lawrence family was located, is difficult to pinpoint. Although clearly, from historic maps, it lay somewhere within the center of the present-day community of Monmouth Junction. They're saying north of Ridge Road and east of New Road, west of Lawrence Brook. That makes sense. Taking into account the local topography and the fact that the most attractive settlement locus most likely was the eastern end of the low, knoll-like landform from which Ridge Road takes its name, that overlooks the headwaters of the Lawrence Brook and Heathcote Brook. It seems reasonable to suggest that the Longbridge Farm was focused near the eastern end of Mary Street and Hillside Avenue. So if anybody drives in that area, make sure you get onto Mary Street and Hillside Avenue, because you'll probably be in the location where the experts say the manse was. Among the currently standing buildings in this area, there are no obvious candidates that fit the bill of a large mid-18th century farmhouse like the structures shown on the old maps. Most buildings in this part of Monmouth Junction date from the late 19th or 20th centuries, the period when the village took on its role as a small railroad community, hence Monmouth Junction. There is one older dwelling, however, the Roland Mershon House, which predates the railroad era and does contain probable 18th century elements in its form and fabric. While unlikely to represent a heavily altered main house from the Longbridge plantation, parts of this building may relate to some of the lesser dwellings on the Lawrence estate. The house is more obviously, both from its architecture and from the documentary record, the principal dwelling of the Rowland family, which moved on to the core of the Longbridge property. So what they're saying here is the Roland Mershon house was the main house for the Rowlands, but not the main house for the Lawrences. Okay? Now we get to some landmarks here, and this is where the apple tree comes in. An unusual hybrid apple tree, grafted to produce both red and yellow apples, formerly stood some 20 feet to the rear of the main section of the house. Now, what's the big deal about hybrid apple trees? Well, the elite of that upper class that I'm talking about, one of their hobbies was to graft branches of one tree onto another tree and develop various types of apples. This was a big deal. The Wetherells were involved in this, so were the Lawrences. This is of particular interest in light of a footnote at the end of Thomas Wetherell's letter to Thomas Lawrence in 1754, in which he asked to be sent a few scions of your best and largest pears. In this instance, Wetherell and Lawrence shared a common interest in horticulture, and both men were experimenting growing fruit trees in their orchards. In other words, this was an endeavor by gentlemen farmers. Wetherell is requesting of Lawrence some cuttings from his pear trees. The little used word scion means a young shoot, twig, or sprout of a tree used for grafting to another stock. Although impossible to prove at this stage, it is tempting to view this apple tree, now long gone, as a remnant from the Longbridge Farm orchards. In addition to this tree, the researcher also noted the presence of many large old walnut trees on the property. Although these could well date from the 19th century Roland rather than the 18th century Lawrence period. Okay, so that's a landmark that was once there, is not there. So we can't use the trees to prove where the Lawrence core property was. There are numerous reports of archaeological finds in the vicinity of the Roland Mershon house, some of which are of considerable interest. Apart from the typical materials one tends to find in the yard areas around historic farmhouses, such as ceramic sherds and pieces of glass, nails, bone fragments, and oyster shell, there are some specific objects that deserve further comment. The researcher has found a Native American pestle. This was found in one of the yards in the area. This is an unusual cylindrical stone, 8 inches long, 2.5 to 3 inches in diameter, flattened at one end and tapered at the other. Pestles were indicative of grinding grain, and most date back to the Woodland period, 800 AD to 1600 AD. Now, this is way before the Lawrences got there. This find suggests that there was a Native American campsite somewhere nearby. Now, it's interesting, just like with the roads, the major roads back in that time were based on Indian trails, like the Assunpink Trail turned into what we know now as Route 27. Well, it's the same with Indian campsites. Some of those campsites were taken over as core areas for farmland when the Europeans got here. Same topographical and environmental traits that attracted Thomas Lawrence to this general location in the mid-18th century would have drawn Native American attention. Okay, stream nearby, sort of high land overlooking other land, good lookout place. It's dry land, so it's ideal for a location for something big. Also, the researcher has found 2 bayonets recovered during the course of gardening in a side yard of the Roland Mershon property. The better preserved of these 2 specimens is made of a non-rusting metal, probably steel. It's about 18 to 20 inches in length, 1 inch thick, triangular in cross-section. On the basis of this latter characteristic, these bayonets have been assigned to the Revolutionary War era data. Whether it was a British bayonet or American bayonet, you'd have to lean on the side of it being an American bayonet and the same for the other bayonet. That means that you can probably line up the bayonet location with where some of the troops were camping out that stayed at Longbridge Farm. Okay? Randy, I'm all set and finished with Longbridge Farm. The only thing left is the story of Peter Ridley.
Peter Ridley, okay. I have a slide up of enslaved male. I have, it's like a pencil and paper drawing. So you can talk about Peter Ridley. Yeah, Peter Ridley, I was reading about it too. It's pretty interesting. Or did you look at the, you read the report from the genealogical magazine in New Jersey, right? From 2005. Is that where you're getting
right?
To?
I've read a lot about Peter Ridley. Yeah, that was one of the sources.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. But go ahead. Yeah, you can. The right slide is up. So go ahead.
Okay. The thing about Peter Ridley is that in the South Brunswick population, you did have black slaves, and you had free blacks. And Peter Ridley is one of the important figures in the struggle of African Americans to gain their freedom. His story is an early story, and it was definitely a struggle. So here we go. And he's connected with Longbridge Farm. That's why we're bringing it up. In late 1784, the Supreme Court of New Jersey inquired into the status of Peter Ridley, there perhaps being some question as to whether he belonged to the estate of Samuel Okeson. Samuel Okeson was an overseer on the Longbridge Farm. On the 16th of November of that year, a writ of habeas corpus was issued by David Brierly, Esquire, Chief Justice of New Jersey, to Benjamin Applegate, commanding him to have, and Peter Ridley's nickname back there was Negro Peter, who was detained in his custody before the Supreme Court immediately after receipt of the writ. Applegate returned the writ with an endorsement dated 31st of January, 1785, stating that he had Peter ready for an appearance in court as he had been commanded. While named at first in the records as Negro Peter, the defendant came to be referred to more generally as Peter Ridley. It was not until April term of 1785, however, that the court considered the case. The wheels of justice, of course, grind on a long, long time. On the 9th of April, 1785, a series of 5 affidavits were taken before Isaac Smith, Esquire, one of the justices of the Supreme Court, relative to Peter's status as a free man. All were highly favorable of the Ridley family. On the basis of these affidavits, the court ruled on the 14th of April, 1785, that Negro Peter Ridley was freeborn, and it ordered that he be discharged accordingly. Now, what the backstory is. Peter Ridley was born about 1761 at Longbridge Farm in South Brunswick Township, Middlesex County. This farm was actually a large commercial venture, more in the style of a southern plantation. It was established in the 1730s by Thomas Lawrence, a prominent inhabitant of Philadelphia who held many public offices and was at one time mayor of that city. He died in 1754, and ownership of the farm passed to his son, John Lawrence, who was also a mayor of Philadelphia. The area in the vicinity of the farm was generally known as Longbridge. Part of the farm was within the bounds of what is now Monmouth Junction. Although born free, Peter was reared in the household of Samuel Okeson, who was said to have been overseer of Longbridge Farm for a time and subsequently may have rented it. Now, an overseer is one who is the manager of the labor force. So Samuel Ogeson would have been in charge of the slaves as well as the freeborn workers who were working at Longbridge Farm. In the 1770s, he owned property in Upper Freehold, Monmouth County, and so probably lived there. But in any case, he was at Longbridge Farm until at least 1773. He was a Tory, and in the early years of the Revolutionary War, he went to Long Island. The reason was he wanted to get out of the way so he wouldn't be harassed and tormented and possibly killed by the Patriots. He took Peter Ridley with him. Okeson's property in Monmouth County was subsequently confiscated, and sometime after the death of Okeson, Peter returned to New Jersey. And that's when things started for his seeking of freedom. And the last thing I'll leave you with are the names of the other Ridleys who were in South Brunswick for a time. I don't believe we have any more Ridleys left in the area. But back at the time, this was a good-sized family. Benjamin Ridley was born in 1790. Elizabeth Ridley was born in 1794. Elinder Ridley was born in 1797. And Ephraim Ridley, I don't have a birth date for. They were probably the children of Samuel Ridley, who was probably a brother of Peter Ridley. And Samuel married a Susanna. I don't have her last name, if she had a last name. And then there is a Will, Black Will was his nickname, Ridley. He's an early one, born in 1755, and he may have been Peter Ridley's father. He was married to a lady named Diana. Don't have a last name there. Randy, that gives all the information I have, other than all the court records on Peter Ridley, another famous person from South Brunswick.
Yeah, I have a question about how they're born free. They're called freeborn, or is it born free? And then they freeborn, and then they have to be discharged. So they have to file for that, right? Even though they're freeborn, then they have to sort of ask for to be official. How does that work? Do you have any insight on that?
Let's say that somebody is freeborn. There has to be record of that. And usually African Americans who were freeborn had papers to prove that they were freeborn.
Okay.
Because if they could do that, especially in a northern state or colony, then they didn't have any trouble. They got into trouble if they didn't have a means to prove that they were freeborn. You know, for an African American to say, I'm freeborn, and have nothing to back it up, the Europeans in those days, European Americans, didn't trust what an African American said. So just because a person says I'm freeborn, to many people that doesn't hold any water. That doesn't mean anything. So they had to have proof.
Okay, so that's affidavits.
And even if they had proof, there are many, many cases where a freeborn person was thrown into slavery or sold into slavery. The record of that is immense. And then, you know, I mean, you had a big scam going on back, you know, this was that South River thing where you had guys with a boat who were buying slaves, and I'm sure there was some that they caught that were actually freeborn from farmers in this area, you know, Central Jersey and all that, and put on a ship and sold down the river, down the Mississippi, and so forth, to work the cotton fields down there. This is when it was difficult to acquire slaves, you know, because they had cut out the slave trade from Africa quite a while ago. And so we were involved in that, which was a real terrible time. But the thing is, you had to have the papers to prove that you were freeborn. You had to have some documentation.
Okay. And that was gotten through the affidavits, right? So you had to go and they had to do some research and that was the affidavits. That was the reasons to have those.
Yeah, yeah, and see, Peter Ridley, he was freeborn, but he was taken by this guy who was technically his boss, and Samuel Okeson was treating him as a slave.
Okay. All right.
And so it got to the court thing. I think Okeson's widow actually went to court to try to get Ridley back.
Okay.
And she lost in court. But the thing was, there was so many scams and shenanigans going on. It was horrible. And you know, just because you were freeborn didn't mean you were going to be free for the rest of your life. There was no guarantee.
Okay.
Now, if anybody has any questions on the artifacts found at Longbridge Farm or on Peter Ridley, let's hear the questions. If not, Randy, I am finished.
I got a question on Peter Ridley. Maybe I didn't quite catch it. He was freeborn. Why was he freeborn? Was his parents freed slaves along the line somewhere, or?
Well, one of the indications would be he had a last name. It may be possible that one of his parents was Caucasian, was a European American.
But that didn't necessarily make you free. Proof was Jefferson.
Well, true, but it's possible. I'm just saying what the possibilities are.
Gotcha.
He may have been freed. We don't know exactly, like his parents. If he was freeborn, it's possible that his parent was freeborn. In other words, black will. And I have a black will Ridley in the census that I did for 1800. And it's possible that his father was freeborn, therefore he would be freeborn.
Sure, okay.
Another possibility is that his parent might have been mentioned in a will of somebody who freed their slaves when they died.
Okay.
And then if that person is freeborn, then that person's children will be freeborn. So those are three possibilities. There are other possibilities. It's very complicated, you know, and very difficult to get your freedom. And then to top that off, very difficult to maintain your freedom back in this time.
Okay, so it sounds like what you said is descendants didn't have any trouble. They remained free up until up through emancipation.
There, my records show when I did this census for 1800, there's about 40 African Americans in the South Brunswick area. Of course, back then it included Plainsboro and Cranberry and the Windsors and all that, all the way down to the dividing line between East Jersey and West Jersey, because that's how far Middlesex County went, that were free. Okay? And close to 200 were enslaved. So if you work on that percentage type of thing, maybe about 20% of the African Americans in the area were free. Not necessarily freeborn, but free. And most of those people got their freedom by being mentioned in a will.
I gotcha. Okay.
Okay. Again, it's very difficult with the statistics. It's also difficult, you know, like if you're doing genealogy and so forth, many of the slaves that I have in the slave census of 1800 don't have a last name. And I would say about 60 to 70% of the free African Americans have a last name. And therefore, it's very difficult to trace a lot of the genealogical stuff without a surname. And you know, it's really a challenge. And as we look at the current situation, a lot of these families have disappeared from the South Brunswick area. So and so it's really difficult to get somebody who's working on genealogy to utilize this information because they're not around here for me to help them, you know, that type of thing. But the reason I did the census for 1800, I don't know if you know this or not, but the New Jersey census for 1790, the federal census, the 1800 and 1810, done every 10 years, was destroyed by the British when they burned Washington, D.C. in the War of 1812.
Okay.
So we don't have any census information on these people. I had to use many, many sources just to get names, like wills of people and that sort of thing.
Wow.
But now we have, because I did this, we now have a census for all the people in the South Brunswick area, 1800. And that's available to anybody who wants it, by the way. You just have to tell Randy, and I'll get a copy with your name on it at the reference desk in the library.
Oh, great. Thank you.
Okay. Anybody else still standing out there? Okay, Randy, that wraps it up.
Okay, that was a great presentation. Thank you, and I just want to let everybody know that we'll be not meeting in December, and we'll meet again in January. And I'll have updates for everybody, and I'll put information about the 10 crucial days that happens every year in Trenton, the reenactments. So yeah, so we'll be doing that again. So we'll see you again in January, and I'll be in touch. I'll send you updates and everything. So thanks for coming
Okay,
out.
Randy.
Have a good night. What's up?
Randy, I just wanted to put in a plug for my book,
Oh yeah,
13
right.
Stripes. Anybody who's interested in reading a good mystery about the South Brunswick area back in 1775, pick up a copy of 13 Stripes. Just Google Barnes & Noble, Ed Belding, 13 Stripes, and you're in business.
You could get it at the library too.
Yeah, you can get on the list. There are thousands of people on the list.
All right. Well, hey, thanks everybody for coming out, and we'll see you soon. Have a good night.
Okay, take care, Randy.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
What is the book title?